Have you ever thought about what practically it's going to look like as the great shaking takes place globally, one way or another? I mean, imagine in the future, Donald Trump, in a matter of 150 days or so, could be in office, and oh my gosh, the intelligence community, the apparatus on the left, complete meltdown. They have a riot machine, like on speed dial. We already know this from Molly Ball, wrote it in the Time magazine. If Trump was elected before, they had streets ready to go in flames, and they said, you don't have to do it. We succeeded in keeping him from office. Well, they've already told us what they're going to do. What's that? How's that mayhem going to affect the marketplace? You ever thought about that? How's it going to go on Wall Street with the investors class when America's in a free fall in terms of its governmental structure? Do you know what the Democrat Jamie Raskin said? He said, if we can keep the House, in other words, if we can win the Congress on January 6th, when it's time to certify the electoral victory of Trump, we'll overturn it on the basis that he's an insurrectionist. Can you imagine the turmoil? Boy, they got the movies about civil war. I have not been predicting it. I am rebuking it. I'm saying it's not going to happen. I really don't think America has the stomach for it. But I'll tell you what, the entrenched powers are so dark, they will do anything to keep a transition from power happening. So where do you go for stability? What are you going to do for stability comes January 2025? I'll tell you what's interesting. I have a senior economist associated Milton Friedman who's going to be talking about the inevitability, the absolute mathematical inevitability of the snapping of the rubber band in terms of the stretching of the American dollar and the American economy, and the whole globe is about to go through a financial reset. While America is shaking, the globe is going to shake, and the economic systems of the world are going to have to be reset and recalibrated. In the midst of that, my guest today is going to show you his plan for Christian influence, stability, prayer, and the blessing of self-government that the founders gave us to show up in Texas, Oklahoma, in certain states where the economy is going to go through a reset, but it's going to be a softer reset than other parts of the country that have rejected God's rule. You might say it's a sheep and goat realignment of states. Oh, that sounds kind of crazy, and it would be if I wasn't talking to somebody of the caliber of the economist that I've got as a guest today. I'm about to go into that broadcast, but the smart thing for you to do is to know if what I'm saying is even possible. Why aren't you investing in gold and silver and certain precious metals that can store stability in the event of the shaking of a global economy and the dollar flying all over the place? Go to lancewallnau.com/gold and realize I'm not crazy. I'm actually quite sane. lancewallnau.com/gold. Protect your retirement, protect your assets, protect your children, protect yourself from the chaos that's coming. lancewallnau.com/gold. And you'll be glad you listened to me. Now let's get into this most extraordinary interview with the illustrious Milton Friedman associate Mark Nuttall. Recently with our guest Mark Nuttall, we have been exploring the coming collapse of a global economy. The fact that nations are all over their head in terms of a ratio of debt to their own GDP, or their ability to produce goods and services. The United States has been the great titan ever since World War II. God favored us with the ability to belt the world with our values, and democracy indeed started coming alive. You have countries that wanted to follow America and in our model of government and freedom and democracy and our marketing. We belted the world with internet phones and iPhones and all kinds of things. But now we're realizing the American era is coming to an end. And it's revealed in our inability to discipline ourselves, like the Roman Empire in its collapse, with debt and foreign wars and no fiscal responsibility. It doesn't have to end this way, but we're going that way. So we have to look at the end times with a sober eye. We're looking at an election cycle, whether Donald Trump is in office or not in office. This economic reset, this inevitable collapse by the law of physics is going to happen. It's surprising, Mark Nuttall, that it hasn't happened already. I remember years ago, you talked about a debt wall back in, I don't know, we hit the physics of this thing. It became dangerous around when? In 2012. But somehow we've been printing that money, and the sheer momentum of things is keeping the thing. It's like when you cut off a branch, the leaves are green. The leaves are green, Mom. It's still alive. No, it's dead. It doesn't know it yet. Then gradually, over a week or two or three, we're now in the autumn of our era going to winter. And we're now seeing the leaves shrivel up because we went past that debt wall years ago. We couldn't sustain it, but we kept going.
The season of debt financing and accumulation is coming to an end for the main reason that mathematically it can't be sustained. The point of all of that is that governments refuse to yield to the laws of, as you say, economic physics, and therefore are living on a false hope that somehow they can bend the rules. And it's like gravity. You can drop something and it won't occur. And so we find ourselves in this paradox of elected officials not telling us the truth, yielding to the fallen world's desire for things that they don't necessarily need without discipline to stay in power. And because of that, now we're out on a ledge. Now you mentioned the green leaves. The reason we're able to extend it this long is because there's a one world currency that is the primary currency of the world. We are the reserve currency. We're also the primary currency.
And you're referring to the dollar as
the dollar. Thank you. U.S. dollar. The United States government is actually the Federal Reserve of more than one country. You have a few countries out there that the dollar is their currency. And so we're the Federal Reserve of that country also by association. And we're not managing the world's supply of dollars with the discipline and respect that we should for our trading partners. But this can go on for a while. What Milton Friedman predicted this, by the way, and some of the charts and some of the analysis, the mathematical equations that I presented are his work. But he used to describe it as when you hit the point, when you've crossed the lexicon of too much of the liquidity of the world is going to deficit spending and not private sector for protective purposes, you stretch the system like a rubber band. So it's tied to 2012 and it's being stretched and stretched. The reason it's still there is because there's only been two times in history that the world's economic system was dominated by one currency. One, the Roman Empire, which is a wholly different system and didn't have the banking system we have today or investments and so on and so forth. You had interest and money changers and other things, but not like you have today. But the Roman Empire and the United States. So in the modern world.
It's amazing. Let's just say that if people catch this. Only twice in history has there been a one world currency. The Roman Empire and the United States of America.
And the United States. And so through the development of the Western world since the time of Christ, you had more than one currency competing against each other. And at the time of the Rothschilds and the 16, 17, 1800s, you had 5 countries that had basically parodies of the same strength in Europe. And they leveraged off each other, and they kind of kept each other in check. Because if the French franc got too weak for whatever reason of improper management, people would gravitate to the British pound or the German mark or whatever. And now all you have is the dollar. And as we went through this last graph, you've got local currencies, many of them former colonies that have weak currencies that aren't traded outside their country. And the cost of getting the dollar back, I've made that point. And so we're stretching this, and this was Milton Friedman's example. I used to talk, well, what about Japan? Japan's underwritten their banks. They've underwritten corporations. They dumped automobiles in the United States at a loss. He said that you can do that, but it's not sustainable. And when you do that, you have to pay the cost later for the cost of underwriting those things. You can push it, and then it peaks, and you fall. And sure enough, the 2 or 3 decades of stagnation, he was absolutely right. And so
you're talking about Japan's economy.
Yeah, and so Japan stretched that rubber band, and then it popped at some point past the point where it had past the lexicon. So here's the United States, and we're stretching this rubber band, we're stretching this rubber band, we're stretching this rubber band, and it will break because you can't print and borrow forever. It's not mathematically possible, and it's not biblical.
All right, so we have a scenario where the thing's going to break. And I really did want my audience at some point to understand, we're talking about Milton Friedman. There's a debate right now, people, because the stinking academic system got taken over by Marxists, and they are selling your sons and daughters on a utopian fantasy that government can solve all their problems if we could just stamp out the unbelief, like the Christians, get rid of these people. Then we could have utopia on earth. The reality is, it doesn't work. It's never worked. And part of the naivete is the idea that these zealots, these young zealots in these schools are being taught that you got to get rid of the greediness of what? The greediness of the corporations. When I was in England, it's amazing how socialistly weird England is, because the Christians are great, but the moment I talk about free enterprise in a business, the Christians started censoring me. They've been indoctrinated in the fact that corporations are greedy, as though governments aren't driven by sin or by the flesh or the fallen. Like the only redeemed humanity is government? No, they're the most dangerous. That's where the Antichrist comes from. Watch a classic conversation between your mentor, Milton Friedman, and Phil Donahue, who was the equivalent of like the View today, except he had charisma. They're just annoying. But I want you to watch this, because what made Milton Friedman so powerful as the Jewish economist that he was is notice how he communicates as a Chicago professor in a way that the students get it, and watch how he uses humor and shock therapy to make an audience go, oh, wow, I didn't know, because Milton Friedman had a genius about educating Americans about free enterprise. Watch this segment.
And when you sit in your study and throughout your career as a professor, you've met students and you've probably dealt with every kind of question, stupid through. I guess I want to know whether you've ever been tempted to become politically revolutionary. Here's my question. When you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power within, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea to run on?
Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade. If you want to know where the masses are worst off, it's exactly in the kinds of societies that depart from that. So that the record of history is absolutely crystal clear, that there is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of the ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by a free enterprise system.
But it seems to reward not virtue as much as ability to manipulate the system.
And what does reward virtue? You think a communist commissar rewards virtue? You think a Hitler rewards virtue? You think, excuse me, if you'll pardon me, do you think American presidents reward virtue? Do they choose their appointees on the basis of the virtue of the people appointed or on the basis of their political clout? Is it really true that political self-interest is nobler somehow than economic self-interest? You know, I think you're taking a lot of things for granted. And just tell me where in the world you find these angels who are going to organize society for us. Well, I don't even trust you to do that. Let alone myself.
One of the nice things about having your own show is when you're able to say at any time, we'll be back in just a moment.
I want to take a moment to talk about the volatile financial time that we're in. And I want you to empower yourself with knowledge. My people perish for lack of knowledge, the Bible says. Visit lancewallnau.com/Birch and get a free information kit. Consider discussing how to shift your 401k or your retirement account into a tax-sheltered gold and silver account. Why don't you go to lancewallnau.com/Birch right now and take action for a secure future. Don't you miss Milton Friedman, ladies and gentlemen. And his point is that Obama and this is what I particularly loathe in the political discourse of America, is when these politicians come off as angels of light, acting with almost yearning sincerity and tears in their eyes. They make their appeal for you when in fact they're trained by Alinsky in the acquisition of power, and they're interested in the levers of power and money and control, and they'll seduce you with words, as the Bible says. They'll make merchandise of you with rhetoric and get your vote. And then, oh, you're really getting a deal, aren't you? You get your college loan forgiven. You're going to get credit cards given to you. Well, they'll buy your votes like Imelda Marcos, throwing dollar bills out of a bus window. But then when your whole system collapses, you realize that wasn't the system that actually was going to set you free. It would enslave you.
Lance, seeing that clip brings back a lot of great memories. I hadn't seen him in a while. I want to tell you one thing, too, that I used to have spiritual conversations with Milton Friedman.
Spiritual conversations.
And that I'm a Christian, and he was of the Jewish faith.
Nice Jewish boy.
And so he made a point once that I've never forgotten. He showed me mathematically, economically, why at any given time in history, 10% of the people needed charity. And then he said, do you have any question why the basic tithe is 10%?
What?
And he would come back and talk about, from his faith, particularly from the Old Testament, how everything he believed economically was tied to God. And I mentioned to you the quote in my book when I brought him to Oklahoma City once, and he was speaking at Oklahoma City Christian University. I had about 1,000 people in the audience, and he started the conversation by saying, what is a Jew boy like me doing speaking to a Christian university? And everybody gasped, including myself. I'm going, oh my gosh, I've offended my mentor. Then he turned and laughed and said, Mark, get your heart back out of your throat. I'm just making a point. The reason a Jew boy like me is speaking to a Christian university is because we're all in this fight together. Without freedom of choice to be able to manage our free will, we have no ability to pursue the religion of our faith and our choice. In other words, freedom of religion is dependent upon freedom and economic choice. And then went on to make his presentation and had everybody, hanging on every word. You only have to ask yourself this question, and I would like to ask any young person who thinks that there's some sort of utopian benefit to totalitarianism, then why do they have to outlaw God as a concept? Why is it illegal in every communist country to worship, or to have a concept that there's a greater calling, or that there's a creator or a greater purpose? Why? And if you can answer that and still believe in communism, then we'd go to the next stage of why it doesn't work and why it never has worked. I will tell you this one last story about Milton Friedman, if we got time.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was his counsel in front of the United States Senate when he was debating the need for a balanced budget constitutional amendment. And he felt so strongly about this curtailment of deficit spending that he thought there ought to be some legal structure that at least members would say, I can't raise spending because it's against the law, at least, because they didn't have the will to do it otherwise. And he said, if we don't, this is back in the 70s and 80s, if we don't get this under control, that rubber band will break. And he believed that spiritually. But Senator Ted Kennedy was chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. There are 250 cameras in the back of the room, and he's losing badly, just like Donahue was in that debate. I mean, Milton Friedman's just making mincemeat of the entire Senate panel. And finally, Dr. Friedman looks at Senator Kennedy, I remember that bench. It was higher than, it was, anyways, that was the image I had as a young lawyer. And he said, Senator Kennedy, socialism hasn't worked in 6,000 years of recorded history. When are you going to give up on it? And at that point, Senator Kennedy reached up. I remember seeing the blood in his knuckles, and he's leaning over the bench and said, Dr. Friedman, socialism hasn't worked in 6,000 years of recorded history because it didn't have me to run it. And got up and walked out of his own committee, on his own committee. Vice chair had to move into the chair and then adjourn the meeting. It's this illogical obstinance of the pervasive evidence of why it doesn't work. First, economically, mathematically, and then, but more importantly to us as Christians, it is outside the biblical concept of God's order for society to take away your choices at the family level and your pursuit of happiness. That term, pursuit of happiness, by the way, in the Declaration of Independence, doesn't come just out of thin air. I mean, that is a long dialogue of English philosophers about the individuality of the person and their rights. And so he was a great man. It framed a lot of issues for me. And now all that he taught and all that he predicted
is coming to a head right now. Because to your point, no politician, especially the way that the left and the media, and now with academia and corporations, control the languaging, gender-affirming care, as opposed to, what is it? Chemical and surgical castration of your little boys. So what we're doing is we got a language. And then you have the reality that if you don't have a constitutional or a legal amendment that forces a balanced budget, a politician, I just got the aha when you were talking. I know it. There's not a single politician that's going to say, I choose not to give you what you're asking for, therefore vote for me. He's got to say, I am not allowed to spend what I do not have. If I could, I would, but I can't. Without that binding scenario where your congressman can't spend money that we don't have, they're going to keep spending money to get elected and then kick the can down the road until there's no more road and you go over the cliff. I've only got a minute here, so I'm going to ask you guys to give me 4 more minutes on the clock. I want to go fast forward. It's going to be 2025. The election has happened. America's in a revolution. Trump is in or Trump is out. The streets are burning either way. America's in chaos because the radical left will never accept the jurisdiction of Trump, and America can't survive the leftist Marxist takeover of government, and enough Americans will have been voted for Trump to feel as though the election was stolen. I don't even want to go down the scenario path of where we're going to be come January. But I'll tell you this, economic reality, the perfect storm is about to hit, Mark. In spite of the incendiary cauldron of American political turmoil, boom, a gavel is going to come down in terms of economic adjustment, and you're going to have this flurry of activity. There is a way, ladies and gentlemen, that you as a Christian can focus on what you do have control over, your emotions, your mind, your family, perhaps your neighborhood, your streets, your community. Mark, you've got a scenario here, and I gave my staff time here to put the strategic implementation visuals together. We're going to need a vote that floats. I think we're heading to Malta. I think we're in a biblical scenario where a storm is going to break up our ship of state, the economy, and we're going to have to apostolically scramble on the beach of a foreign territory called Malta. It's the equivalent of the ark being built to carry us through, or in my metaphor, the ship breaking up and landing in new territory. Walk us through in a matter of minutes a scenario where the sheep and the goat nations are going to be sorting themselves out, and in America, sheep and goat states are going to be sorting themselves out because some want freedom from government and they're going to insist on it. Some are going to go to the government to get bailed out. Tell us what the plan looks like.
Well, first, in the reset, debt will have to be recalibrated, renegotiated. Some banks will make it, some won't. The biggest concern for me is that community banks will be absorbed into regional banks, and without community banks, family-owned businesses lack capital. So our plan is to develop economic councils that provide for the connectivity of family businesses to the local economy in support of each other, and partially through churches. Churches analyzing the database of their membership, how they make a living, comparing that to other churches, probably in about a 35-mile area.
So let me summarize this. 35-mile pockets of communities, businesses, churches, maintaining civil order, trying to work out how their communities are going to work. But let me just pull up at the 30,000-foot view. You were attending Jordan Peterson's event of influencers and intellectuals that I was not invited to, by the way. But anyway, you were there, and you were at that conference, and you talked to some economic visionaries that were at the conference with Jordan Peterson on shaping the future, the desirable future. And they said the United States, where were the countries that they said in the inevitability of an economic reset had the greatest capacity to handle the collapse? What parts of the world were they looking at investing in?
Well, in ascending order, number 3, Singapore, just because it's a country with very little land, and they have to be innovative to handle their investments, and they still have private ownership of investment. Second, India, because it's got all the necessary elements of resources, shoreline, energy, water, but also a demographic base of a large percent of the population under 45 in the workforce. But the number one place to invest, and the number one place, they said if they had to move someplace, would be Oklahoma and Texas.
Oklahoma and Texas. Put 4 more minutes on the clock. I want to talk about this. So Oklahoma and Texas were the destination locations. Why?
They have the elements necessary for a self-contained regional economy: energy, agriculture, deep water port, rail, highways, and one of the largest gas collection systems, which is Oklahoma, to fuel industry. So the necessary things of energy, water, and food, the basic components of the stabilization of society are present there currently and don't have to be developed. But also because of open areas, a climate, or an ideological climate of can-do, open for business, state legislatures that are looking for ways to help the country rather than turn to the federal government. They see all those things. And I think the other thing that surprised me about Brits that said that they would move to Oklahoma and Texas is way of life, just decency of people.
Decency, the conservative values and faith. It isn't necessarily the religious. It's the fact that that religion creates a culture that respects family and law.
Well, and some said because they do respect religion.
This 35-mile economic development area with churches and merchant banking and new banking to help sustain Christian businesses, et cetera, barter and exchange. What is page 23 in your geographic boundaries of the Federal Reserve? You thought this out. What's that?
Well, this is how the United States is. These are the 12 divisions of the Federal Reserve. Now, you got to understand how is it that the Federal Reserve calculates interest rates based on New York versus, say, Oklahoma, where the difference is as much as 30% the cost of doing business, and you have one prime rate. Whatever it is. And so it's a blended rate, and through these districts, this is how the economy is reported to the Federal Reserve, and they make their decisions. I don't disagree with these breakouts. This goes back to 1913 when the Federal Reserve was established, and this is how you get one prime rate for all central banks in the United States.
All right, so banks are going to be kind of like centralizing around that, except for the innovative new banking we're going to be seeing emerge. Go to graphic 24. And we got the red and blue states. What are we looking at here?
What, in my opinion, will happen, community banks will be pressured to roll up into regional banks. Capital will be restricted. Debt will, when it's recalibrated, unless it's forgiven, will be austere in that the banks will control a lot of cash flow until some of its debt's paid down.
And so what we're looking at here for the podcast audience that is not able to see the rich graphic detail that we have provided for our viewing audience, you've got Texas and Florida and the Carolinas, and looks like, what do we got there? Montana, Kansas,
Iowa,
Arkansas, Louisiana,
yeah.
Mississippi.
Yeah,
So, but what looks to me, I think when the electoral map shows up after Trump is hopefully in office, you might see there's even more red than we think. But the point is, those states are not going to wring their hands and go calling Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom, or Michelle Obama. They're not going to be the ones that go, please help us. It's going to be the blue states that do that. So these red states have a chance of doing something.
We will center, District 1 is Oklahoma and Texas. But as we expand these economic councils and associations, we will do it by region first, and their need and their receptivity to the programs of also working with churches, Christian business owners, and family business owners to stabilize their local economies within their states. Okay, then you can see how I've rolled it in using the divisions of the Federal Reserve, which is the way the Federal Reserve will analyze banking, versus the red states that will look for their own help. And we'll coordinate with the Federal Reserve. The United States is going to survive. The dollar's not going away, but it's all going to be reset. And when you look at and when you approach it by these regions, this is the optimum strategy on how to roll out community alliances, economic alliances, through the church networks of the United States. Okay, then you go to the last slide. And what some are already telling me is focus on Oklahoma and Texas, get that in place immediately so that you can export it out throughout the United States. Look, Lance, what I think is going to happen, this is coming, if the body of Christ steps up with churches through small businesses, family business owners, we can stabilize any community, and by stabilizing the community, stabilize any state. It'll be like an Old Testament structure of the 12 tribes of Israel. The financing will come between the tribes. We'll finance each other. There'll be a credit rating for family and Christian-owned businesses because they pay their bills, and banks are going to be looking for credible people. They won't know who got hurt or who didn't get hurt in the reset. And we're going to provide all that for them through a Christian merchant banking services system. Then when that happens, and when the blue states go to the federal government will have no answer because they can't print and borrow money anymore for a while. And when that happens, they'll say, well, we can give you what we got, but we can't give you any more. And then what is going to be the example? The red states that were open to a Christian church solution will be the answer. And then, and you made the point to me, there's areas in California, there's areas in all those states. But believe it or not, Boston, Massachusetts is one of the places they're asking us to get up there and talk about this.
So in other words, there's red territory in Northern California, and look at Russell Johnson, Washington State, Portland. So we might be able to see literally carve-outs or cutouts where Christian community, just as in the book of Acts, when famine hit, the Gentiles bailed out Jerusalem. Wouldn't it be interesting if the Christians were to mobilize themselves? And by the way, that we're far more, I guess we're out of time here, but there is a precedent for this in history, isn't there? 4th century, Christianity literally became the dominant force for cultural formation in the 400s because they did this model, didn't they?
They did. And the article that you've got there in your hand is taken from a Roman historian, a secular historian, who was complaining about those godless Galileans who's providing more basic support for Roman citizens than Rome was. And what they were doing was sharing didn't throw in the middle of the room and everybody took what they wanted. It was food, shelter, and clothing and care for their children. And the average, didn't matter whether they were Philistine or Sumerian or Corinthian, didn't matter what they're, or Roman citizen. It was reflecting the unconditional love of Christ in a time of crisis, that the harvest and the storm, which the article of that you've got there, was one of the greatest times of evangelical growth in the history of the church. I mean, it's exactly what you think Jesus Christ would have us do: prepare, share, and represent him.
Wow. And I'll just conclude with this. Julian the Apostate wanted to set aside Christianity and bring back the ancient pagan worship, but he saw the problem that atheism, which was his term for the Christian faith. It's funny, we were the atheists. You know why? Because we didn't believe in their deities, so they considered us godless. He said they've been especially advanced through their loving service rendered to strangers, their care for the burial of the dead. It's a scandal that there isn't a single Jew, meaning Christian, they were Jewish converts, who is a beggar. And that those godless Galileans care not only for their own poor, but they're caring for ours as well, while those who belong to us in vain look to us to help them for the services that we're supposed to render, and we don't do it. So the historians argue that one of the reasons for the spread of the church throughout the Roman Empire was the practical expression of Christian love. The early Christians did not rely upon the government for anything. After all, they were being persecuted by the federal government. How much like today is this sounding? We're coming right back to it. Mark Nuttall, how can people stay in touch with you, and how can they keep in touch with you as I'm closing out this wonderful series of moments with you?
Well, there's more information on all of this coming. The best place is to go to Mark, M-A-R-C, Nuttall, N-U-T-T-L-E.com, marknuttall.com.
marknuttall.com, and you can freedom@lancewallnau.com. If you have a question for Mark you want to ask, just go to freedom@lancewallnau.com and let me know, and I'll be sure to ask him, because there's stuff that we didn't get a chance to get into here, but you'll be back again, and I'm looking forward to being able to cover these things. And you have something that's an archive that I want to be able to talk to you about, which is your recorded interviews with Milton Friedman that the world has never heard. Just out of curiosity, what does Milton talk about on those private recordings?
Well, questions that I asked at the time, which are very similar to today, about government out of control without any apprehension whatsoever, what they were doing to those around them at the state level or our trading partners. And he comments on those things, but he was kind enough to give me an interview at his complex where he lived after he was retired. Well, it's never been seen before.
Perhaps. Oh, is it video or audio?
It's video.
It's a video interview. Boy, I'd like to get a hold of a minute or two of that one to wet your whistle. All right, we're going to be back again on our next broadcast with more prescient and unpredictable coverage of what's happening in the world. Remember this, when the shaking begins, you heard about it here. China is not as strong as you think it is. The world's going to be making a choice between freedom and servitude under the seduction of security. But we're going to start to see America first in the shaking coming in 2025. It's inevitable. And sheep and goat states are emerging. You might as well be the first county that's prepared. Leadership that's ready isn't leadership that is lacking. So we'll be talking more about this in the days to come. And so I'm going to have to sign off right now and say bye-bye. What happens if a natural disaster takes place? We have these weird tornadoes that hit in the Midwest and in Texas, but look at the hurricanes in Florida. People can literally have their houses flooded, or they're in a situation where they have no food or access to groceries. Everyone needs at least a 4-week emergency food kit. And fortunately, My Patriot Supply has created a 4-week emergency kit. And these products will last for 25 years. The interesting thing is they give you a 2,000 calorie per day meal. And that's the key. Delicious and 2,000 calories a day, because that's what you're going to need to sustain yourself for 4 weeks in a crisis. We had a winter freeze here in Texas, of all places. And we had a couple of days where we had no electricity. I'm telling you something, this makes a huge difference. Mushroom rice pilaf, fluffy rice and mushrooms, seasoned with red wine and herb. And then how about starting the day off? Maple Grove oatmeal, old-fashioned oats, maple flavoring with a pinch of brown sugar. This is what you want to do, 4-week emergency food kit, and that's just for you. Think about your children. Guarantee somebody around you is going to need help. You're going to want to at least have the 4-week emergency kit. Go to lancewallnau.com/patriot. Use that link, and you're going to get a special discount on their special 4-week emergency kit promotion.
Did you enjoy this latest episode? Please remember to share it with your friends, because the more knowledge you have, the better equipped you are to navigate the world.